For 2 years, a man walked a woman to her car in the dark, 90 steps across a parking lot, every night she needed him to. He never asked her last name. She never offered it. And neither of them knew on any one of those nights that those 90 steps were quietly threading themselves into something that would change both of their lives. That is where this story ends up. But to understand it, you have to start at the beginning, when Tobias Starfall was just a man in a gray uniform who showed up on time, did his job, and tried to make $14 an hour stretch far enough to keep the lights on at home. The Caldwell Medical Properties Complex sat on the eastern edge of the city. 3 buildings connected by covered walkways, a parking structure on the north side, and a surface lot on the south. It housed about 40 medical tenants, everything from a cardiology group on the second floor of Building 2 to a pediatric dental practice on the ground floor of Building 3. During the day, the place hummed with people. By 7 in the evening, most of the offices had gone dark. By 10, the hallways were quiet enough that Tobias could hear his own footsteps on the polished floor. He had worked the overnight shift there for going on 4 years when this story begins. His shift ran from 9 at night until 5 in the morning, and he shared it with 2 other guards named Deshawn and Carl. Deshawn was a few years younger than Tobias, pleasant enough but always angled toward the break room television when the complex was quiet. Carl was older, a former warehouse supervisor who had taken the security job because it was easier on his back, and who spent most of his shift in a rolling chair near the front entrance with a paperback novel face down on his knee. Neither of them was a bad person. They showed up, they watched the monitors, they walked the perimeter at the required intervals, and logged it properly. They did the job. Tobias did the job too. And then he did a little more. He was 34 years old that first autumn. He had a broad, patient face, close-cut hair going silver just above his ears even though he was still young, and hands that looked built for heavier work than pressing elevator buttons and shining a flashlight into stairwells. He had done heavier work, most of his 20s actually, in a warehouse not far from where Carl had been a supervisor, loading pallets and working freight lines before his father's health made it necessary for him to take something closer to home. $14 an hour was less than he had made in the warehouse. The overnight shift was harder to sleep around, but the complex was 12 minutes from his father's house, and that mattered more than the hourly rate. His father, Earl, was 67 years old and lived with a combination of congestive heart failure and type 2 diabetes that demanded constant management. Earl was a proud man, the kind who would tell you he was fine when he wasn't, and who resisted every attempt to treat him like he was fragile. But the medical bills had been piling up for 3 years in a slow and relentless way that Tobias tried not to add up too carefully. There was a cardiologist visit every 6 weeks. There was a pharmacy bill that ran between $400 and $600 a month, depending on what needed to be adjusted. There had been one hospital stay the previous winter that left a balance of just over $9,000 after Earl's partial coverage paid what it would, and that balance had been joined in the month since by smaller ones that brought the total to somewhere around $22,000. Tobias knew the number. He kept it in his head the way you keep a stone in your shoe, always there, always pressing. He did not complain about it to anyone at work. He brought his dinner in a plastic container his father packed for him most nights, a habit Earl refused to give up, even though Tobias had told him more than once that he could manage his own food. He ate it at the break room table at 2 in the morning, and he thought about the bills, and then he went back to his rounds. It was in his second year at the complex, late October, that a billing analyst named Renee started working late. She was assigned to the management office on the third floor of Building 1, a suite that handled accounts for several of the complex tenants. Tobias had seen her during his evening rounds before, usually leaving by 7 or 7:30, with 2 or 3 other women from the same office. Then one night she was there at 9:30 when he made his first full sweep of the building, still at her desk with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. He nodded to her through the glass partition. She looked up, startled, then gave him a small wave. He logged it and moved on. A week later, she was still there at 9:30, and the week after that. The other women from her office left at their usual time. Renee stayed. She never explained it to Tobias, and he never asked. But he noticed the way she moved when she finally packed her bag for the night. She took longer than necessary to gather her things. She checked the hallway twice before she stepped out of the office. She walked to the elevator with her keys already in her hand, not jingling them, but gripping them. And when the elevator doors opened, she looked inside it before she stepped in. Tobias had seen that kind of careful movement before. He recognized it. The third night she came down to the lobby and found him there. She paused near the front desk. She said she was heading out. He said he would walk her. She looked at him for a moment as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. And then she said, "All right, thank you." They went out through the south entrance and across the surface lot to her car, a dark blue sedan parked in the third row back, about 90 steps from the door. Tobias walked beside her, not behind her, at an even pace, watching the lot the way he watched every space he moved through without drama, just attention. When they reached her car, she unlocked it, got in, and he waited until the engine turned over, and the headlights came on before he turned and walked back inside. That was it? That was all it was. She came back the next night and the night after that, and each time she left, Tobias walked her out. He did not announce it or make a policy of it. She did not ask him to keep doing it. It simply became the shape of the end of her night, the way a ritual becomes a ritual without anyone deciding on it, because the thing that caused it was still there. What had caused it was this. About a year before she started working late, Renee had been walking to her car in the complex's north parking structure when a man had come up behind her very quickly in a stairwell and grabbed her shoulder. She had gotten away. She had reported it to the building's management and to the police, and the man had never been identified, and the incident had never escalated into something worse, and from the outside it looked like a close call that had resolved itself. From the inside, it had not resolved. It had settled into her body the way those things do, as a low and constant alertness, a habit of checking twice and holding her keys and listening to her own footsteps in empty hallways to make sure they were the only ones she heard. She had moved her parking spot to the surface lot, where there were lights and open sight lines. She had started staying late because the rush of evening departures, everyone leaving at once in the low-visibility structure, felt worse than waiting it out. And she had not told her father any of this, because her father was a man who responded to problems by trying to solve them with resources, and she did not want to become a problem her father felt he needed to solve. Her father was Victor Caldwell, and Victor Caldwell owned the building they were standing in. She had no idea Tobias did not know this. It simply had not come up. She had no reason to introduce herself as the owner's daughter, and Tobias had no reason to ask who her family was. He knew her first name from her ID badge and her office door. He knew she worked late and that the walk to the car seemed to help her. That was enough for him. The months accumulated. November became December, and December became the gray, cold stretch of January. And Tobias walked her out every night she was there. She was not there every night. Some weeks it was 3 nights, some weeks 4. Some weeks she was traveling or sick or had a reason to leave early. The night she wasn't there, Tobias did his rounds and came back to the break room and ate his dinner and thought about his father. The night she was there, he walked her 90 steps across the lot and watched her drive away and went back inside. Deshawn asked him about it once, early in the spring of the first year. They were in the break room, and Deshawn had looked up from his phone and said, "You still walking that woman to her car every night?" Tobias said yes. Deshawn nodded like he was absorbing information and went back to his phone. Carl had a version of the same observation a few months later, delivered without judgment, just noticing that Tobias added the walk to every shift the woman stayed late. Tobias confirmed it. Carl shrugged and turned a page in his novel. Neither of them joined him. Neither of them offered to split the duty. They were not cruel about it. It just wasn't something they were moved to do, and Tobias did not press them. At home, the bills kept arriving. Earl's cardiologist adjusted his medication twice that year, which meant 2 rounds of prior authorization paperwork and 2 stretches where the pharmacy balance ran higher than usual while the insurance company deliberated. There was a follow-up echocardiogram in March, which produced its own statement, and a podiatry referral in June for diabetic foot care, which produced another. Tobias kept a folder on the kitchen counter at his father's house where he put all of it, each envelope opened and the balance written in pencil on the front. By midsummer, the folder was an inch thick, and the total had grown past $17,000. He did not tell Earl exactly how much. Earl would have told him not to worry about it, and they both would have known that was not true. What Tobias did instead was pick up a weekend shift at a different property when it was offered, a small retail strip 2 miles away that needed coverage on Saturday afternoons. It paid $12 an hour, not 14, but it was something. He worked it most Saturdays through the summer, which meant he slept about 5 hours between the end of his overnight shift on Saturday morning and the start of the retail shift Saturday afternoon, and then drove home Sunday with his eyes heavy and his back sore, and sat with his father for a few hours before starting the week again. Earl would look at him across the dinner table on those Sunday evenings and not say what he was thinking. And Tobias would look back and not say what he was thinking. And they would talk about baseball or about the neighbor's new dog or about whatever Earl had watched on television that week, and it was fine. It was the specific fineness of 2 people who love each other and are protecting each other from the weight of their shared situation. In the evenings at the complex, the nights went on. October again, 2 years in now. The leaves came down in the parking lot, and Tobias walked through them on his rounds and thought they made the surface lot brighter somehow, the pale undersides catching the lamplight. Renee wore a heavier coat. They didn't talk much on the walks, they rarely did, but sometimes she'd say something about the cold or about how early it got dark now, and Tobias would agree, and they would reach her car, and she would get in, and he would wait for the headlights and walk back. Once, on a particularly cold night in November, she had turned before she opened her car door and said, "You know, I really appreciate this." He had said it was no trouble. She had nodded and gotten in, and he had walked back across the 90 steps in the cold, with his breath making small clouds in the air in front of him. And that was that. What neither of them knew, or what Tobias certainly did not know, and Renee was only beginning to suspect, was that her father had started asking questions. It had begun the previous spring, when Victor noticed, during a routine review of the complex's after-hours access logs, that his daughter's badge was scanning out of Building 1 consistently between 9:45 and 10:15 at night, 3 to 5 nights a week. He had not known she was working that late. He had thought her hours were normal, that she was there until 6 or 7 at most. Finding the log entries was like discovering a window in his house that had been open all winter, and that he had walked past 100 times without noticing. He did not call her right away. He sat with it for a few days, which was not like him, but the gap between what he had assumed and what the log showed felt large enough that he wanted to be careful before he stepped into it. He called her on a Saturday, casual, asking about her week, letting her come to the subject if she was going to. She did not bring it up. She said work was busy, said she'd been putting in some long hours to get ahead of a backlog, said it matter-of-factly and moved on. Victor said that was fine. He hoped she wasn't overdoing it. She said she was fine. He let it go for a few more months. She was an adult. She was capable. He had not built the habit of micromanaging her, and he did not want to start now. The access logs showed she always left, and left safely, which was the important thing. The investigator came into it in late summer, almost 6 months before the night everything came together. Victor had not intended to hire one. He had been talking to his building manager, a practical woman named Sandra, about updating the overnight security protocol. And Sandra had mentioned, in passing, that one of the guards had developed a custom habit of walking a particular staff member to her car. She said it the way you mention a small, commendable thing. Not a problem, just a detail. Victor asked which guard. Sandra said she thought it was the one who worked the overnight shift in Building 1, a man named Starfall. Victor did not pursue it immediately. He filed the name away. A month later, he asked Sandra to pull the guard's employment record. He read it in about 3 minutes. Tobias Starfall, overnight shift, 4+ years with the complex, reviewed satisfactorily at every annual evaluation. No complaints, no incidents, a clean record with no distinguishing marks in any direction. What it did not tell him was what the man was actually like. What it did not tell him was 2 years of 90-step walks in the dark, the specific patience of a person who showed up for a small kindness, not because someone required it, but because it was the right thing and he was the person present to do it. Victor hired a private investigator to fill in what the file couldn't show him. It was not a dramatic decision, and he did not dress it up as one, even in his own head. He told himself it was due diligence. A man he employed was in regular personal contact with his daughter, late at night, in a parking lot. He wanted to know who that man was. The investigator's report landed on Victor's desk 3 weeks before the night in question. It was 8 pages. Most of it was routine. Residential address, no criminal history, no debt judgments, no flags of any kind. There was a section on his family situation which Victor read twice. A father named Earl, living at the same address, managing a significant cardiac condition and a diabetes diagnosis. Medical expenses estimated in the tens of thousands and growing. The son working overtime at a secondary property on weekends to keep up with the bills, by the investigator's account. Victor set the report on his desk and looked at the window of his office for a long moment without seeing what was outside it. He thought about the nightly access logs. He thought about a man in a gray uniform walking his daughter 90 steps to her car every night for 2 years for $14 an hour. He had been thinking about it for 3 weeks when he went to the complex himself on a Tuesday night in November and waited. He parked in a visitor's space and went in through the lobby at 9, told the guard at the front desk he was doing a property walk and not to make an announcement. The guard at the front desk was Carl, who nodded over his novel and buzzed him through. Victor took the elevator to the 3rd floor, found the management office, looked through the glass, and saw his daughter at her desk with her reading glasses in her hair and a cup of something steaming at her elbow, just like any other night. He took the stairs back down and waited in the lobby near a corridor that ran toward the south entrance. He could see the elevator bank from where he stood. At 9:50, the elevator opened and Renee came out with her coat and her bag. She looked surprised to see him and then immediately reassembled her expression into something careful. He said, "Hi, sweetheart." She said, "Dad, what are you doing here?" He said he was in the neighborhood. She looked at him with the particular patience of a daughter who knows her father well enough to know that is not an answer. Before she could say more, footsteps came from the far end of the corridor, unhurried and even. Tobias appeared from the direction of the stairwell, making his rounds on schedule, and stopped when he saw two people near the south entrance instead of one. Renee turned. She said, "Tobias," he said. "Good evening," and looked from her to the man beside her without visible concern. Just attention. She said, "This is my father, Victor Caldwell." The name sat in the air for a second, and Tobias looked at the man, and the name rearranged itself into its full shape. The name on the property management signs, in every lobby, on every lease document, on the vendor badge Victor wore clipped to his lapel right now. Tobias looked at the badge, then back at Victor's face and said, "Good evening, sir." Victor extended his hand. Tobias shook it. Victor said, "I understand you've been walking my daughter to her car." Tobias said, "Yes, sir, when she's working late." Victor said, "How long has that been?" Tobias thought about it and said, "About 2 years, give or take." Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Every night she stays late." Tobias said, "Every night I'm on shift and she's here." Renee was watching her father's face. There was something working in it that she rarely saw there, something behind the careful composure of a man used to being in control of information. She said softly, "Dad." He held up one hand, not dismissive, just asking for a moment. He said to Tobias, "My daughter tell you why she started staying late?" Tobias shook his head. He said, "She didn't have to." That answer landed on Victor the way a plain, true thing lands when you are not prepared for its plainness. He pressed his lips together for a moment. Then he said, "Come outside with us." The three of them went out through the south entrance into the cold, and they walked to Renee's car together. 90 steps across the lit parking lot, leaves skipping along the asphalt in the wind. Victor walked on the other side of his daughter and said nothing. When they reached the dark blue sedan, Renee turned and told her father the whole of it, standing in the cold with her coat buttoned to the collar. The stairwell in the parking structure 2 years ago. The man she never identified. The reason she had moved her car to the surface lot. The reason she stayed late. The reason she had never told him. She said, "I didn't want you to make it a project." She said it gently, but she said it. Victor listened without interrupting. When she finished, he turned and looked at the route they had just walked, 90 steps back to the lit entrance, and then he looked at Tobias. He said, "You did this for 2 years, without being asked, without extra pay." Tobias said, "I was already here." Victor said, "That is not what I asked." Tobias looked at him steadily and said, "Yes, sir, 2 years." If you have ever watched someone absorb a truth that reframes a long period of their own blindness, you know the particular stillness that comes over a person in that moment, the way they go very quiet before they move. Victor went very quiet. He stood in the parking lot with the cold wind moving and his daughter beside him and a man he had never met, who had shown up for her in a specific and faithful way every night for 2 years, for no reason except that the need was there and he was the one who could meet it. He said, "I'd like to talk to you, Mr. Starfall. Tomorrow, if you're available." "Not here. At my office." Tobias said, "I can do that." Renee drove home. The two men exchanged contact information in the lobby. Victor walked back to his car and Tobias finished his shift. That night, after Carl went home at 5 and Tobias drove to his father's house in the gray early morning, he sat at the kitchen table and looked at the bill folder. He didn't open it. He just sat there with his coat still on and the house quiet around him, listening to his father's slow breathing from the back bedroom. And he tried to figure out what he felt. Not hope, exactly. Something more careful than hope. The recognition that something had shifted without his having done anything to shift it, that 2 years of walking 90 steps in the dark had been witnessed at last by someone who had the power to respond. He thought, I would have kept doing it either way. And that was true. The meeting with Victor took place the next afternoon in an office on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a wide window and a conference table that probably cost more than Tobias made in a year. There was coffee. Victor sat across from him and asked real questions, not the kind designed to confirm what he already thought, but the kind that were looking for something true. He asked about Tobias's background, his experience, his understanding of the complex security needs. He asked about Earl. He asked, carefully, about the medical expenses. And Tobias answered without flinching, because he had not been raised to be ashamed of the cost of caring for someone he loved. Victor told him he had been considering reorganizing the complex's security operations for a while. He was thinking about bringing the overnight management in-house under a direct employee rather than a contract arrangement. There would be real responsibility involved, real accountability, oversight of the other guards, coordination with building management. He named a salary of $62,000 a year, with health coverage and a retirement contribution. He said the position was Tobias's if he wanted it. Tobias looked at the table for a moment, then at Victor. He asked if this was because of the walks. Victor said, It's because of who you are. The walks are how I found out who you are. Tobias was quiet. He said he needed to think about it overnight. Victor said he expected that, and would wait to hear from him. There was one more thing. Victor mentioned it almost at the end, in a tone calibrated not to be the headline, but to be the thing that closed the circle. He said his company sometimes extended certain courtesies to long-term employees, and that one of those courtesies could include assistance with outstanding medical expenses for a family member. He said he had taken the liberty of asking his CFO to look at the outstanding balances associated with Earl Starfall, and that if Tobias accepted the position, he would like to see those cleared as part of the compensation arrangement. $22,000. The number Tobias had been carrying for 3 years in the back of his mind, like a stone he had gotten used to the weight of. He pressed his hand flat on the conference table, just for a moment, and then he nodded. He called Victor from the parking structure of the downtown building and said he would take the position. His voice was even. He thanked Victor, not effusively, just simply and plainly, because that was the kind of man he was. He drove home. When he walked into Earl's kitchen that evening, his father was sitting in his usual chair by the window, the afternoon light coming in sideways across the room, the small television on the counter playing the news on low. Earl looked up and studied his son's face for a moment, the way a man does when he can tell something has changed but hasn't decided yet whether it is good. Tobias sat down at the table and told him everything. The whole of it. The 2 years of walks, Renee, Victor, the meeting, the offer. Earl listened without speaking. When Tobias finished, his father looked out of the window for a long moment. Then he said, You were just doing right by somebody. Tobias said, Yes, sir. Earl said, And it came back. Tobias said, It came back. They sat together in the kitchen with the news playing quietly, and the afternoon light moving across the floor, and Earl reached out and put his hand on his son's forearm and held it there, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The months that followed moved differently than the months before them had. Not easily, exactly, because Tobias was not a man built for ease, but with a steadiness that had room in it, a sense that the weight he had been carrying was distributed now in a way that was survivable, rather than just barely so. He took the new position in January. The salary came with a direct deposit